Attachment is deeper than you think. A deep Buddhist insight. Most people think they know what attachment means. When someone says, "I'm attached to her," or "I shouldn't get too attached to this," the picture in mind is clear. Attachment is a bond between us and something in the world. A person we love, a place we live, a result we want. The fix, in this picture, is to weaken the bond. Care less, want less, hold less. This is the everyday meaning of the word. It points to something real, but it is only one small part of something much larger. The Buddha pointed to attachment in many forms. We get attached to things and people, yes. But we also get attached to our opinions. Notice how it feels to be told you are wrong. We get attached to our methods, our routines, the way we believe things should be done. And most invisibly of all, we get attached to a sense of who we are, what we stand for, what makes us us. Each of these is its own form of holding on, even when we are not holding any object at all. When you start to see this, attachment is no longer rare. It is running, in some form, almost all the time. The big losses we notice are only the loud version. The quiet version is everywhere. So what is the common thread? What is attachment really, underneath all its forms? When you look closely at what is the same across all of them, one thing shows up. It is a movement of the mind that says no to change. No to the fact that the pleasant feeling will fade. No to the chance that our opinion may turn out wrong. No to the version of me not staying solid. Attachment is that quiet no, showing up in many different forms. And once we see this, attachment begins to look much deeper than it first appeared. It is not only about the things we hold. It is about the feelings those things stir in us, the old habits that move before we notice them, and the mind's quiet resistance to change. One word before we begin. The Buddha did not teach about attachment to make people ashamed of caring. He taught it the way a careful doctor names an illness, to understand what is happening, so the person can be free of it. Never to shame them for having it. This is about seeing clearly, not about judging. Start with the everyday picture. We say we are attached to a person, to a place, to something we own, to an outcome we hoped for. We also say we are attached to an opinion, to a way of doing things, to an idea of who we are. In each case, the picture is the same. There is something out there, or in our heads, and we are bound to it. The fix, we assume, is to loosen the bond. But there is a simple thing to notice that does not fit this picture. Consider what happens after you finally get something you wanted for a long time. The satisfaction is real. Within hours, sometimes minutes, it begins to thin out. The object has not changed. You still have it. Yet the feeling that made you want it is already fading. If the object itself were the source, this could not happen. So the source must be somewhere else. You can see the same thing from another angle. The same song, the same piece of news, the same person walking into a room can meet two different people and produce completely different responses. The object is identical in every case. What differs is the feeling it stirs in each person. Put these two observations together, and they point in the same direction. What we are reaching for was never simply the object. We are reaching for the pleasant feeling the object brings, or the relief from an unpleasant one. The object is the doorway. The feeling is what we are walking toward. This is what the Buddha pointed to when he traced where craving comes from. In the teaching he called dependent arising. He showed that craving does not arise straight from objects. It arises from feeling. Something is sensed. A feeling appears. And only then does craving move toward it, or away from it. The object is one condition for the feeling, but the feeling is where craving rises from directly. There is a word for this feeling in the early teachings. It is called Vedana. It points to something more basic than what we usually call emotion. It is the simple, "this is nice," or "this is not nice," or "this is neither," that flickers across us before we have time to name anything. This quiet tone is present in every moment of experience. And here is where the picture widens. The same is true even for the kinds of attachment we do not usually call by that name. Take attachment to an opinion. When you defend a view, what are you defending? Look honestly. Most of the energy is not really about the view being true. It is about the pleasant feeling of being right, the relief of certainty, the sharp discomfort that comes when someone challenges what you thought you knew. Or take attachment to who we are. When someone misunderstands you, what is being defended is not only an identity. It is also the feeling of being known, of mattering, of being valid in someone else's eyes. The same pattern of feeling is at work, only in another form. So the first layer is this. Attachment is deeper than the object, whatever the object is. A person, a possession, an opinion, our own image of who we are. In every case, the bond lives one layer in. The feeling the thing stirs is what we are actually holding. The thing was just where the feeling appeared to live. This already explains why letting go is so hard. When we try to free ourselves by getting rid of the thing, leaving the relationship, dropping the opinion, giving the possession away, we are working on the wrong layer. The mind simply finds the same feeling somewhere else. The knot, never untied, moves quietly to a new object. But this raises a question. If attachment is really about the feeling, and a feeling is brief, coming and going in seconds, why does the pull feel so settled, so practiced, as if it had been waiting for this object long before this object arrived? A passing feeling does not explain a pull that seems older than the moment it shows up in. Something underneath the feeling has already been shaped. That is the next layer down. The everyday picture has a second part. Even when we admit attachment is hard, we usually assume we have some control over it. We can be aware of what we are attached to. We can decide to let it go. If we do not manage to, we blame ourselves. Not strong enough. Not disciplined enough. Attachment, in this picture, is something our conscious mind ought to be able to handle. But there is a recognition almost everyone has had. You notice yourself reacting to something, and along with the reaction comes a quiet, tired sense of recognition. Some part of you says, "I always do this." The reaction does not feel new. It feels worn, as if the path were already smooth, and your foot just found the groove. That sense of the worn path is the second layer, felt from the inside. The feeling that hits us in any moment is brief. It comes and goes in seconds. But underneath the feelings sits something older. The mind's tendencies to grasp, to push away, and to look away were not built in this moment. They were shaped slowly, by repetition, over a very long time. The early teachings call these the underlying tendencies. In Pali, anusaya. They are the part of attachment that has been built through repetition, rather than freshly chosen each time. The Buddha laid out how they form in a discourse called the 6 Sets of 6, the Chachaka Sutta. He put it this way: when you experience a pleasant feeling, if you welcome and keep clinging to it, the underlying tendency to greed lies behind that. When you experience a painful feeling, if you sorrow and lament over it, the underlying tendency to aversion lies behind that. When you experience a neutral feeling, if you don't truly understand it, The underlying tendency to ignorance lies behind that. In plain words, every reaction we have is also a quiet act of teaching. Each time we lean into a pleasant feeling, we very slightly deepen the tendency to grasp. Each time we push away an unpleasant one, we deepen the tendency to push away. None of these are dramatic moments. They are small, and that is exactly why they are powerful. A brief feeling met the same way 10,000 times settles into a habit. By the time a situation arrives, the tendency is already there, already shaped, already leaning in its usual direction. We did not build it in the moment. We arrived at the moment already carrying it. Now there is a second piece, and it is connected. Because craving rises straight from feeling, it does not wait for thinking. A feeling appears, the old tendency moves, and the pull is already happening before thought has had time to form. By the time the thinking mind arrives, the reaction has already started without it. This is what catches people off guard. They study the teaching, follow it closely, agree with every word, and still feel the very same pull. This is not because they understood it poorly. They may have understood it very well. The pull continues because the knot is tied below the level that thinking can reach. Thinking happens on one floor of the mind. The knot is on a lower one. They are not in the same place. The same is true for the decision to let go. It is made consciously, while the pull moves below consciousness. This does not mean understanding is useless. It matters a great deal. Understanding is the lamp. It shows us where to look. Without it, we would not even know there was anything to find. But a lamp is not a hand. Seeing the knot is not the same as loosening it. For that, something other than thought has to go down to where the feeling itself arises and meet it there. So the second layer is this. Much of attachment is not easy for ordinary awareness to reach. It is built up before we know it, and it begins before we can catch it. When it feels urgent and automatic, this is not a sign that we are weak. It is the sound of something running on a floor of the mind where willpower and thinking do not have full access. But this raises one more question. We now know the pull is fast, and built in, and below thinking. None of that tells us why it is there in the first place. Why is the mind so eager to grasp it all? What is it bracing against? That brings us to the deepest layer. The final assumption we usually make is this. When attachment hurts, we blame the situation, this loss, this person, this change we did not want. If circumstances were different, we tell ourselves, the bracing would relax. We would be at peace. But if you watch honestly, you notice something. The same inner bracing shows up across very different situations. Different people, different years, different losses. And yet there it is again, the same tightening, the same quiet no. When one thing keeps showing up underneath many situations, it is not coming from the situations. It is coming from underneath them. If you look for it now, you may even feel it. A faint holding somewhere inside, a low tightening that is not aimed at anything in particular, moving under an ordinary day like a current. That faint bracing is the third layer, and it is what every other layer has been resting on. To see what it is bracing against, it helps to look at how the Buddha described craving. He did not describe it as one single thing. He described it in three forms. In his very first discourse after awakening, the one that set out the Four Noble Truths, he said this: "It's the craving that leads to future lives, mixed up with relishing and greed, taking pleasure there wherever it alights. That is, craving for sensual pleasures, craving to continue existence, and craving for non-existence." Three forms, each different. The first wants what feels good to stay and not fade. The second wants to keep being someone, to continue. The third wants something gone, wants an unpleasant experience simply not to be. It is tempting to put all three together as a wish for permanence, but that is not quite right. Each is a different movement of the mind. One wants the good to stay. One wants the self to continue. One wants the unwanted erased. What they share is something more basic. In its own way, each one is the mind saying no to the simplest fact there is, that things arise and then they pass. This is the urgency we were looking for. Beneath the speed and the habit and the reaching for feeling, the mind is bracing against change itself. This is why a strange thing happens when we lose something small. Sometimes the ache is much bigger than the thing seems to deserve. A small loss, or an ending that should have been easy, can open into a grief that feels far too big for it. The small loss has briefly shown us the rule. For a moment we see, not as an idea, but as a plain fact, that arising and passing is how everything here works, including the things we were quietly counting on. The object that was lost may have been small. What its loss revealed was not. For a moment it showed us the simple truth we spend most of our lives arranging not to see, that nothing stays. The same applies to opinions, to identity, to the version of who we think we are. We are clinging in every direction to versions of things that will not hold still. So the third layer is this. Attachment, at its deepest, is not really about the loss in front of us. The specific person, the specific outcome, the specific opinion are only where the bracing happens to show up today. Underneath them all, attachment is the mind's refusal of how things actually are. It is the no said to change itself. That is how deep attachment goes. It begins with the things we think we want. But underneath them, it is reaching for feeling, shaped by old tendencies, and finally bracing against the fact that nothing stays the same. Seeing this clearly is not bad news. It is what makes freedom possible, because for the first time, we can see where the real work is. Start with what these layers mean for the things in your life, because the relief here is real. Since the knot was never tied in the objects themselves, freedom does not ask you to remove them from your life. It does not ask you to leave the people you love, to give up your work, to hold weaker opinions, or to stop being who you are. You can live fully engaged with all of it. What changes is the relationship to it all, at the root, where the knot actually is. And we now know where that root is. Every layer pointed to the same place. Each one led down to feeling, and to the short moment where feeling either becomes craving or does not. That short moment is where freedom lives. It does not have to be a long, calm pause in meditation. Very often it is something much smaller and quicker. A brief moment of clear awareness in which a feeling is known just as a feeling, before the mind has turned it into something to chase or escape. This is what the practice actually trains. In the early teachings, it is one of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, what the Buddha called mindfulness of feeling. He laid it out in the Satipatthana Sutta in very plain words. When they feel a pleasant feeling, they know, I feel a pleasant feeling. When they feel a painful feeling, they know, I feel a painful feeling. When they feel a neutral feeling, they know, I feel a neutral feeling. That is the whole practice. It is a small, repeated act of knowing a feeling as it actually is, before the mind turns it into a project. Look at what that one act reaches. It meets the feeling directly instead of chasing its object. Done again and again, it wears down the old tendencies, because a tendency is only kept alive by being repeated. And by meeting the feeling early, it opens a small gap before the reaction fully takes over. One simple practice: working on every layer at once, because every layer meets its feeling. What grows in its place over time is equanimity. People sometimes hear that word as coldness, but in practice, it is closer to steadiness. You still feel everything. You are simply no longer thrown by it the way you once were. All of this was offered in the spirit it began with, the spirit of a doctor who names an illness so the patient can be free of it, never to shame them for having it. So this is where we arrive. We think we are attached to things. Look closely, and we are attached to the feeling those things stir in us. Look closer still, and attachment is being driven by tendencies worn deep through long repetition. Closer still, and it is carried by a reaction that moves before thought can arrive. And beneath all of it, there is a quiet wish that things would not change the way they do. The moment the mind begins to see this clearly, right at the level of feeling, attachment begins to lose its fuel. It is not torn out by force. It simply stops being fed. And the life this points to is not the life of someone who feels nothing, who wants nothing, who loves no one. A heart closed down that way would not be free. It would only be numb. What the teaching points to is something quieter and far more livable. The ability to meet your life as it actually is, both the arriving and the passing, without the exhausting grip. When the grip loosens, what remains is not emptiness. It is room to breathe. That is what healing means here. You still feel what life brings. You have simply set down the long fight against the fact that it all comes and then goes.